What's going on, everybody? It's RuralYJ coming at you with a brand new video, and it's that time of the month again. Of course, being the time where I bring y'all my monthly tier list. And this tier list is going to be extra fun because this month we are getting the release of the brand new core set Phantom Nightmare, and ooh boy is this set going to be huge. Phantom Nightmare releases not only a host of new decks, but plenty of support for older decks that just absolutely skyrockets them, or at least significantly enhances their competitive viability. It's going to be a huge shakeup in the meta compared to what it was these last few months, or I should say mostly just the last month, as we kind of recovered from the off season of events, going back into regionals and seeing some jank decks win, like Melfi Sprite again. But after this set, we're probably going to have a much more concrete meta, and while we definitely will still have a lot of diversity in the format, I believe, it's going to be a lot more of the best decks seeing more representation than the lesser decks compared to the last couple of formats. With that being said, let's not waste any more time. Today, I'm bringing you my competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list for the February 2024 format, post Phantom Nightmare. Starting us off, we have Yubel, and we're starting with Yubel because Yubel is, of course, like the main theme of the set, the thing that's trying to be like the selling point to go for like the anime fans. And while I think that it's really cool that Yubel is getting support and a lot of people are really happy with how it turned out, it's not really going to bring the deck to actual like competitive success, in my opinion. You might be able to see success with it at like a locals, maybe even a smaller event like a regional or something, but if you were to like try to bring this to a YCS or something, I'm pretty sure you just get absolutely stomped, because the thing is with Yubel, its main gimmick is doing like the reflection battle damage and like keeping your stuff alive and everything. It's kind of like a bunch of protection and stuff, but it's essentially just taking Makonko, a deck that's already just kinda okay in this format, and just making you jump through 10 more steps just to get to what they could have done with a normal summon. It definitely feels like one of those anime archetypes that gets like a few decent cards and then some other cards aren't really so decent, and they kind of just never give them anything super game-changing, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to continue making support for it, similar to decks like Dark Magician and even Hero. I think it's neat, I think it's really fun, especially as someone that loves reflection battle damage. I literally play Makonko and Lyrilusk, but admittedly I don't really think it's going to be too great. Alternatively though, next we have Voiceless, originally called Silent Force or Silent Force, whatever you want to call it in the OCG, and this deck is also kind of interesting to me because a lot of people are really hyping this deck up. Like, a lot of people, if they can't afford the Fire King stuff, this is the deck they're jumping to. They're having a great time playtesting it and everything. They really like it. But my biggest thing is, I've never lost to this deck, like, playtesting. This isn't supposed to be like a subtle flex or anything, but like, I've literally never lost to this deck, and it feels like it has a lot of problems. Namely, it doesn't really like getting disrupted, especially if they start with like normal summon Diviner or whatever to dump the Hierarchia. And the end board isn't even really anything to write home about either. It's like a negate, I think a targeting pop, and some like mild protection. Which, I mean, obviously, as we're in like a more mid-range format, it's not really bad at all. That's actually pretty solid. But I think when it comes to like moving into the format where we're about to see a spoiler alert, like a bunch of Snake Eyes Fire King, like Labyrinth and stuff, I think mid-range might not be as amazing. But I will admit, again, there are a lot of people that are going to hop on this deck. They really want to play this deck. And so I think from sheer representation alone, plus especially if it gets in the hand of really good players, I think I'm going to put it in the tier 1.5 category. Again, I don't think the deck is like bad, obviously. That's just a stupid thing to say, especially when it's tearing up the OCG, which is a different format, but that's a story for another time. And I think that it is going to be a very popular deck, especially if it does end up getting a little bit cheaper, because that is a wild pre-sale price. And next up is my personal favorite thing coming out of Phantom Nightmare. If you've been following me on Twitter, you know this for a fact. We have Goblins, or specifically the Goblin Biker cards. And I think these cards are really awesome. They're super fun to play with. They have a bunch of different flexibility pieces on their end board they can do stuff with. They have a bunch of different engines you can play as a generic rank 3 deck. You can use cards like Tour Guide, the Punk Package and stuff. The Gold Pride cards were something I was using for a while there. There's a bunch of different things you can do. But I think that Goblin is going to struggle a little bit going into the format. For one, there's no like really good Xyz decks. Another spoiler alert, Purely has fallen off significantly after the ban list. And even before that, it was kind of like on thin ice in terms of representation. And that was like its best matchup when it came out over in the OCG. It's being used as like an engine and stuff for it. But like, none of the decks really in general this format are really going hard on the Xyz cards. And that's where this deck really shines, is in a format which is just dominated by Xyz monsters or Xyz decks. because their effects allow them to detach from both fields to special summon themselves, search, do a bunch of other stuff. And so that'd be like super awesome if we were in a format where Purely was still like a really solid deck, but that's not really the case. However, I do think that the deck has some really solid potential, especially once the new support comes out, especially Pile Up. That card is just huge. But I think even for now, I'm going to put it in the tier 2 category, probably in the middle to lower end. I don't think it's going to be nearly as represented as other decks in the tier 2 category or anything even especially like Voiceless. And you can definitely tell that by the pre-sale prices as well in comparison. I'll definitely be rocking the deck at least for a few weeks so I can mess around with it. I think it's really fun. But I think that it's going to take a bunch of skilled players that want to play this deck to actually like break it in half. I think that there's a lot of potential there though. Alright y'all, let's address the elephant in the room. Fire King isn't technically getting support directly in the next set and like stuff, but we're getting Snake Eyes Populous, or Poplar, whatever his name is now, and also Promethean Princess, and both of these cards just completely flip Snake Eyes decks and Fire King builds on their heads. You get to go through some really insane combo lines, especially with a bunch of 1 to 1.5 card combos. The Diabellstar engine's going to absolutely skyrocket. We're just seeing a bunch of people really hyping this deck up to be a potentially tier 0 threat, which I don't agree with. I think this deck is far from tier 0 and it has plenty of counters, but it's just one of those decks that, like, similar to tier, not exactly like tier, can just keep coming at you no matter how much you throw at it. It's like you think it's like, oh, I've gone through 2-3 hand traps, but they're gonna keep on playing. And then not to mention, it is one of the grindiest decks we've seen in a long time. Like, literally everything about this deck just has stuff in hand you have to worry about, stuff on field, stuff in grave, especially when it comes to follow-up turns, especially with like the Wanted engine, the Snake Eyes stuff. All that gives them just so much follow-up. Not to mention their end board can end up being pretty nasty too, using cards like Amphibious Blowship and Blow Whale to special back an SP Little Knight from their graveyard after popping it off the Promethean Princess and one of your cards. Then they're getting a special summon from the Flamberge Dragon or their field spell if they're playing a more pure Snake Eyes build. Not to mention that they can use cards like Fire King High Avatar Kirin, dodge like target removal or anything like Imperm Veiler, etc. There is just a lot going on with this deck, and there's actually a bunch of different variants you can play too, because similar to like just Fire King in general, a lot of people were testing with the other fire decks such as Rescue Ace and stuff. You can play a Fire King Snake Eye build, more of it just like a pure Snake Eyes build with more non-engine. There's just so much you can do, and this deck is going to be absolutely everywhere, so it would be an absolute crime not to put it at the top of the tier 1 category. This is going to be the deck to be in the room. Next up on our list we have Goaty, and Goaty is getting 2 really solid support cards coming out of the next set. And interestingly enough, as we discussed in our hand trap tier list, which you should totally check out if you haven't already, annotation will be up in the top right, of course, cards like Impermanent Veiler aren't going to be as represented because it doesn't really do as much against decks like Fire King. And that's really cool, especially if you're playing a Coelacanth variant of Goaty, which just can go absolutely insane, getting like a bunch of disruptions on board, getting all your Goaty's things set up, going for like a mass board banish on your opponent's turn, and like 2 other synchro plays. There's a bunch of things you can do with that deck. Like, seriously, I have a Sleeper Sunday episode on this deck that just shows how explosive it can be if the Coelacanth does not get negated. However, it doesn't really detract from the fact that if you're not playing a Coelacanth build, or if you just don't see it or don't have a way to access it, it's really hard to play. Like, they really struggle in getting tuners on board without having to use their normal summon or something like that. And even ignoring cards like Imperm, cards like Ash and Ghostbell are also still really prominent cards that are going to make it very difficult to play as a Goaty player, even with the awesome new stuff they're getting. So I'm going to put it in the rogue category. I'm going to put it above Yubel because it does have a lot more potential than Yubel, especially if you are on Coelacanth stuff. But overall, I don't think Goaty is still in the best of spots. Year of Water this year, though. Trust. Year of Water. Next up, we have Magispector, and this is actually a deck a lot of people forgot was getting some really nasty support coming out of Phantom Nightmare, with a brand new Link monster and Xyz monster, and also a new main deck card that's pretty solid as well. And let me tell you, this support is actually really damn good. I mean, it doesn't really do very much in terms of giving the deck an actual end board piece most of the time, but that's actually not really a huge deal because Magispector's big thing was mostly consistency. They already had some pretty decent consistency beforehand, but now with the Link monster, that's just like basically Electromite on crack, just locking you into Magispectors, you can actually do a lot of things. You can grab your Trap card, which is a monster banished by tributing a wind spellcaster. You have a quick play spell that's the same thing but for destroying, and you even have a Solemn Strike built into the archetype, and none of these cards are hard ones per turns. Not to mention that you're not even just locked into Magispectors, you can also go into some Draco Slayer stuff, which is insane when it comes to consistency, and you can have a bunch of different 1 to 1.5 card combos utilizing the Draco Slayer cards that'll also get you a lot more follow-up. And did I mention that Secret Village becomes searchable because of it? However, at the end of the day, it is still a Pendulum deck, and Pendulum has just been nerfed so heavily into the ground by Konami. Even right now, you still have cards like Anti-Spell running around, and a lot of people on things such as Lightning Storm, Harpies, and even Cosmic Cyclone to out back row decks, which are really popular. And so you're gonna have a pretty hard time, especially when we go into games 2 and 3, where a lot of people, if they were already maining cards like Droll, are absolutely going to be playing cards like Droll against you. I'm gonna put it at the higher end of Rogue, mainly because I don't know how the representation is going to be. If the representation of this deck is high enough, there are always those people that will force Pendulum into any situation and will actually get some results out of it. So I can see it going to tier 2, maybe even above stuff like Goblin and everything, but it really just depends on the representation. Coming up next, we have Horus variants, and this is literally just a massive umbrella term here. Like, this can apply to basically any competent deck utilizing the Horus engine, things like Orcust Horus and stuff like that. And Horus variants are actually going to do pretty well, I think, going into the next format, mainly because Phantom Nightmare is giving them some new stuff. The monster that's basically just a retrain of Horus the Black Flame Deity doesn't really matter, but the new field spell is pretty neat. Basically, it acts as a Rhoda during your main phase that makes you put a card from your hand on the bottom of your deck after you do it, but can search for cards like Imseti to help you get your King Sarcophagus live and your draw. And its name also becomes King Sarcophagus, which is pretty cool. So even if your opponent like outs the King Sarcophagus you actually have, they can still come back from the graveyard on the next turn because you have the field spell. And that brings me to basically the best part of Horus variants, is that the follow-up they provide is such a nice cushion, especially for weaker decks, and it's just good in general in graveyard focused decks. In a format where a grind game is so important, I think that Horus engines are going to do really well, and I think it's also really cool that we're in a format where we're going to have a lot of spot removal from the Fire King decks, not so much like against them, but like from the decks like Fire King, things like the Princess and everything, that's actually going to make the Horus on field effects pretty damn scary. I mean, you have Imseti, which is a non-target send for any card in the field to the grave if your card leaves the field, and then you have Happy, which is just absolutely broken. I mean, you get to add back 2 cards that are banished or in the graveyard. Oh my god. Because this is such a broad umbrella, I am going to put it like at the top of the tier 2 category. There's a bunch of different decks that can utilize the Horus build. Like I said, there's stuff like Orcust, but then you can go all the way to like Horus Gate Guardian, and it's just like there's a significant difference in quality there if you couldn't tell. But I think that, like I said, just about any competent deck that can run a Horus engine, be it either for the level 8 bodies, just the big bodies in general, or like the graveyard effect setup, I think that they're going to do pretty damn well. Coming up next, we have Fluanderies, and Fluanderies, funnily enough, is technically getting support out of Phantom Nightmare, at least indirectly in the form of, I believe it's called Swallow's Courier. This is a quick play spell card that says tribute a winged beast from your hand or face up field to add one from your deck to your hand with the same level. And this may not seem like too much, but it's basically a second playset of Advent of Adventure for them. I mean, you can use this to dodge cards like Imperm or Veil, or even just spot removal in general, and get another card out of it. Plus, it can even turn cards like Toucan, Stree, or even DD Crow that are kind of dead in your hand into cards that you actually want to see. However, this does come at a pretty unfortunate time because, as I mentioned, cards like Imperm have been falling off, or at least will once we hit this next format. And so it's not really that amazing to get that card at such a time. It is still a pretty solid addition to the deck though, and also Flu has one thing going for it, that being one of the only decks that can really reliably use Dimension Shifter. Again, as mentioned in the Hand Trap tier list, Dimension Shifter is going to be an absolute powerhouse going into the next format. Between going against decks like Lab, Fire King, etc., there's a lot of decks that really want their graveyard, and even like Runic variants and stuff, so it's going to be pretty damn nasty to hit them with a Shifter. However, it is one of the weaker decks to play Shifter, at least since Barrier Statue got banned, even though Featherstorm is definitely still a card. I'm going to put it at the very top of Rogue. I don't think it's going to see like the most representation, which is a big thing, but it is a very solid option after Phantom Nightmare because of the addition of Swallow's Courier and just how powerful Shifter and Featherstorm are. Next up on our list is Rika, and Rika is going to be pretty damn interesting. I guess I should just call it Plant Link because of the addition of the Aroma cards. Now, I mentioned this in my last tier list, I still haven't gotten around to looking at exactly what the cards do for the deck. I mean, I know that the reasons that the Sun Avalon cards got hit on the last Forbidden and Loaded list was because the new stuff allowed them to like loop Jasmine. I think it was like 4 times per turn, which is insane. But with those hits, I don't really know exactly how the deck is affected. I just know that it becomes significantly better. Not to mention, out of Legacy of Destruction, we're getting a lot more really powerful cards, such as the Fairy Circular thingy. For now, though, I think I'm going to be comfortable putting it in tier 2 above Goblin, but below Horus variants, mainly because, as I always say, Plant Link is one of those decks that isn't super represented, or if it does, it's like one of those very low turnover rates, I should say, because there's just going to be like maybe, say there's like 50 Plant Link players, only like 2 of them are going to have a chance at topping. So I'm going to play it super safe. I'm going to put it in the tier 2 category. I think it'll probably be pretty damn solid. I just actually have to get around to knowing what it does. Next on our list, we have Branded, and I don't think the outlook for Branded is that fantastic. Moving into next format, the best hand traps we're going to be seeing are cards like Ash Blossom, which is notorious for being a usual turn ender against Branded half the time, and Ghost Bell, which kind of just defeats the entire like best gimmick that Branded had, being the Gimmick Puppet Lock, for those that were still playing it at least. I don't really know if Branded players have moved past that yet since I played it. So like, unless you have the Mercurier, which I mean most combos can get it for you, but if you don't have it, you're kind of just fucked in that regard. Not to mention that while it isn't like the worst deck to play through Shifter, it's still not going to be like the best deck to play through Shifter when you could have just played something else. I don't really think the outlook for Branded is going to be super huge, especially when you could have just played Bestial Runic instead. Coming up next, we have Drytron, and I mainly just wanted to put Drytron in here for like my friend to be salty when I tell him that this deck is going to be kind of bad next format. So admittedly, they did kind of get like support in the form of the Arcana Force. I think it's the Fool that searches the field spell for the World FTK, where like it's just one of like the million ways Drytron can skip your turn, but this time it's like literally skipping your turn. But it's a lot more convoluted than just doing the Magician of Black Chaos Max stuff that they had been doing before. But not to mention, we're moving into a format with Ash, Bell, Droll, and Shifter. Not to mention decks like Bestial Runic running around playing things like Bestials. It just feels like the worst possible fucking format for Drytron to exist in. I will still put it above like Goaty and Yubel and stuff, because I think it's just like a little bit better than those. Well, it's a better deck overall significantly, but it's like the amount of counters going into next format for Drytron are kind of just insane. Moving on, we have Castra, and Castra, interestingly enough, which I'm pretty sure that Arise Heart's supposed to be a Fenrir. I thought I changed it last time. Whatever. Castra is actually not nearly as bad as a lot of people have made it out to be, including myself. I will admit that I was on like the Castra hate train. After Arise Heart was gone, the deck technically doesn't have like its super stupid win condition anymore. But it is still a pretty damn good deck. I mean, like I said, Shifter is going to be massive, and this is like basically the best deck to ever play Shifter. And even without your giant walking macro Cosmos with a non-once per turn, just attach anything from the banish to get follow-up, etc, etc, you're still ending on some pretty massive bodies. Not to mention that even blocking just a couple of zones off Shangri-Ira instead of like a bunch of them is a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. I mean, blocking off some back row zones so Lab can't go full set 5 pass if they want, or even just blocking off like 2 monster zones against a combo-based deck, it's gonna hurt them pretty damn bad. Plus, on top of the Shangri-Ira, you're also going to be ending on cards like Unicorn and Fenrir to rip cards from their extra deck and on the field, and you're gonna have all the follow-up you could ever want. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure Unicorn's like a 1-card like OTK, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure it is, so that's pretty good too. Plus, I mean, you get to main Fenrir and actually have it be a combo piece instead of just being Fenrir, so that's pretty solid. So I'm actually gonna put it above Rika and Goblin and stuff in tier 2, below Horus stuff, because I think the representation of Horus variants is going to be a lot higher because the blanket is just massive for that term. But I think Castra is actually a lot better than a lot of people had expected, mainly because Shifter is just such a powerful card, and because of the versatility of the Castra cards going first or second. Alright, moving on, we have the next elephant in the room, that being Labyrinth, and Labyrinth just got transaction rollback out of Maze of Millennia in this last month, and moving into Phantom Nightmare, I believe that starting from the first few YCSs especially, it is going to be a very highly represented deck. there are going to be a lot of people preparing for Labyrinth, but a lot of people playing Labyrinth at the same time. And mainly it's just because Transaction Rollback is such a strong card, especially for playing against cards like Ash Blossom, which had previously, similar to Branded, usually just completely ended a Labyrinth player's plays, but a lot more punishing because compared to a monster-based deck, it can't really extend very well past that most of the time. Transaction Rollback basically allows them to ignore Ash though by banishing itself and paying half to copy your cards like Big Welcome and Welcome Engrave. Not to mention it gets multiple uses out of cards like Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon multiple times per turn, and that card is just so damn good, especially moving into a format where Link monsters are going to be all over the place. And so I think that Lab is going to be one of the best decks of the format. And I mean, I guess I could just say like knock on wood, because I say that like a lot, that I think Labyrinth is going to be really, really good, but then either the representation isn't there or the deck just gets shit on by cards like Lightning Storm and Duster. But I think that Rollback's going to be a lot better for the deck at least playing around or through those cards, and I think it's going to be pretty damn good. Coming up next is Mannadium, and y'all, I still think that Mannadium is a really nasty deck. I mean, you can do kind of just anything you want with this deck, between things like a full hand rip off of like Omega and stuff. You can do the King Calamity lock by just doing, I'm pretty sure, like a 2-card combo, something like that. And then, I mean, you can also just play like kind of a freelance version of Mannadium where you like end on like Baron, Apo, Savage if you want, shit like that. There's a lot of different things that Mannadium can do, and the only thing that kind of guarantees to stop it most of the time is Droll and Lockbird. And while I think that Droll is going to be pretty damn good going into the next format, especially against decks like Fire King stuff that can either go like Ponix get Drolled, Bonfire get Drolled, stuff like that, I think that it's still going to be more of a side deck card than anything. So I think Mannadium can easily steal multiple tops, if not wins at events, because it's just so damn powerful and explosive. Especially when you combine it with cards like Vicious Astrolaud, it is genuinely one of the most resilient decks I've ever faced until you floodgate them, and that's like only going to be prominent with Labyrinth or if you're playing Droll. Coming up next we have Purely, and like I said, Purely kind of just disappeared now. I don't really think it's been topping too many, if any, of the most recent regionals, and that's just kind of interesting in my opinion. I mean, all we have for the deck's hits are Sleepy Memory to 2 and Delicious Memory to 1. And you think that's not really like the most insane thing ever, but I mean, it cuts off the consistency, not just because there's less special summon cards in your deck, but also because you are not guaranteed anymore to get either of those cards off of your My Friend Purely. Sure, you can reveal 2 Sleepy, 1 Delicious, but most of the time you'd rather see the Sleepy going first. And we're moving into a faster format where just sitting on an X Purely Noir doesn't really do as much anymore. I still think it's a good deck overall, especially because now you just have so much space for non-engine, which can be really solid. And there's just a bunch of different stuff you can play, like the Dark World engine, which is cool. So that can get you like a little bit of more like resources. I think that you can definitely still do things with the deck. I don't think it's bad at all. I just think it's crazy how fast it plummeted, but I don't really know if that's because the power level went down or just the popularity did. Next we have Dragon Link, and I think Dragon Link's not going to be like in the most amazing spot moving into the next format. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Dragon Link's a bad deck, basically like ever, but there's just a lot of factors such as Troll, Shifter, even a well-timed Ash can really make this deck hurt, especially the more and more cards it gets hit on the list. And if you really want to place things like the Bystials, like I said, you can play a deck like Bystial Runic instead. So I feel like there's just better options you can play, but I can definitely see Dragon Link still taking tops at the next format. Up next we have Sprite, and I mean, now that I think about it, I actually just haven't had Bystial Runic on the list, talking about Sprite, because I was about to mention like a bunch of like Runic Sprite stuff, and then I just realized that I have been talking about Bystial Runic, and I just completely removed it from here. So I guess technically you can also treat this section as talking about Bystial Runic. Both of them are going in the tier 2 category, even though Sprite has nothing to do with Bystial Runic, I'm just saying that now. I think that Sprite variants, especially because the Runic engine remains basically untouched other than exactly one copy of Fountain, like, it's just so damn solid. I think the Runic cards are just absolutely insane, basically in any format that they are allowed. And even I personally, I'm playing like the Live Twin Runic Sprite, which is kind of like one of the lesser Runic builds right now, but I just still think it is insane. There is so many different things you can do between like synergies with cards like Droplet and everything like that. You can play like Nimble packages and stuff, especially if you're playing like a more regular Runic Sprite variant. I just think there's a lot of awesome things that this deck can do. Not to mention that even though SP is a card and people are playing more Links, Ibly is still pretty damn solid, especially if you have a way to remove their normal summon, if they try to normal summon and then link off with it. Plus, a lot of sprite variants, if they're not on like Runic, or even if they are and they just go for like a Mannequin Cat line, can play through Shifter, and that means they can play it themselves, which is pretty good. Next up, we have Dinosaur, and even with the stuff out of Maze of Millennia that is pretty damn cool, Dinosaur just does not feel great, like, ever anymore. Like, as long as Misk remains at 1, the deck's just going to feel really bad because you just fold so much to Disruption, even after you use Misk and you get, like, Ash or something engraved, and it just feels like it bricks a lot and has a hard time extending. So even with, like, the cool instant fusion stuff going on and, like, searching Lost World or Diagram and things like that, I really think that until the deck gets Misk back to 3 even, or just more extension, I don't think it's going to be in for the greatest time. Next up is Unchained, and I'm a bit torn here, because I think that Unchained actually is still a good deck. I mean, losing the Charvaro only made it, like, hurt against cards like Imperm, which, again, we're not going to really be seeing as often compared to cards like Ash going into the next format. And it also kind of hurt, like, a little bit of the follow-up for some of the combos. But at the same time, I'm really not sure about the representation of the deck, because while it is still decent, we're going to see a lot of people moving on with the shiny new toy syndrome going on for decks like Labyrinth or Fire King, or especially Voiceless, and just completely abandoning Unchained off to the side. Because I think power-wise, it's a 1.5 for me. I mean, the deck can even play Shifter if it really wants to, like it used to back before the new stuff came out. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that Unchained can do to put it in the 1.5 category, but in terms of representation, I'm going to put it in the tier 2 category because I don't think it'll be as represented as a lot of the other decks on this list, especially the ones in the 1 or 1.5 category. But basically, TLDR, the deck is just completely the same as it was before. You might just play an extra copy of Shiyama to replace the 2 Charvara you lost, sorry. And you just kind of have to play a little bit more conservatively, but your combos are exactly the same. The Big Wave King Caesar is a really damn good card. Ending on your Link 2 is also really cool, especially if you can get an Escape of the Unchained with it, so that board breaking isn't really as big a deal. Overall, good deck, kind of bogged down by the last ban list, making it a lot less popular. Next on the list is Vanquished Soul, and I mean, the deck hasn't really gotten anything like super crazy. It's kind of like one of the weaker Fenrir decks you can play. Tickboo just went to 1 last list and kind of just made it lose its big boss monster is one of the big things. At the end of the day, though, it is a Shifter deck, and I think that's pretty damn good. And then once it gets its resource engine going, it can be really hard for even the most grindy decks to outgrind it. So I'm going to put it at the top of Rogue. I think the deck is fine. It's just really bogged down by its consistency, and then, I mean, at least you don't have to really worry about Imperm and stuff, which they didn't have to as much anyway, but cards like Ash are definitely going to hurt really bad. Coming up next is Rescue Ace, and Rescue Ace has gone from an interesting spot as, like, the best deck of the format, like, just a couple of months ago, to kind of like this deck that's not nearly as popular as the basically just replacements for it in the form of these Snake Eyes and Fire King variants and stuff like that. Of course, though, you can literally use the Rescue Ace cards in the same vein as the Fire King / Snake Eyes cards. Like, you can do the exact same stuff. Like, literally, I'm gonna put it in the 1.5 category. I think that a lot of people, especially now that the Rescue Ace cards themselves are actually cheaper, ignoring the Wanted engine and stuff, like, because of the Hydrant reprint and things like that, I think that it's going to be a lot more represented, and I think that it's going to see a lot of play similar to the Snake Eyes Fire King stuff, maybe even alongside both archetypes at once. It still does the exact same thing it did before, but it can also flex with the Fire King and Snake Eyes cards to go into more of a combo-heavy end board, and still end on all 4 Rescue Ace back row, on top of, like, the Promethean Princess and Blow Whale stuff. Really cool, and I still think it's really solid. Finally, to wrap up our list, we have Centurion, and I think that Centurion is okay. I think the deck is getting a lot more representation than it was before. In fact, I'm actually going to put it... I think Castor is a better deck, but I think that Centurion's going to have a little more representation. I think that the deck just is getting a lot of play, and I think that it's fine for what it does. I mean, especially now that we are losing cards like Imperm in the format and stuff, and I don't think Ghost Bell is, like, too crazy against the deck despite being popular as a hand trap. So, I mean, you really just have to worry about, like, Ash and stuff. It's, like, the only downside is the deck is fragile, but going into King Calamity is still pretty fucking nuts. and will win you just about any game that you can actually pull it off. The deck does significantly get cooler and like more interesting once we get Legacy of Destruction, and hopefully by then we'll actually ban King Calamity, but because it gets like those awesome new support cards like the new main deck monsters, Synchro, and Quick Play Spell that increase the deck's consistency by a lot and actually gives them a lot more to do, which I think is really cool. But for now, I'm going to put it around the upper end of the tier 2 category, mainly due to the representation of the deck. And that is going to do it for my tier list for February 2024 post Phantom Nightmare. I think the format's going to be pretty cool, mainly because of just how many cool different decks you can still play, even though the popularity of the top decks is going to be pretty high. And I can't wait to see how it shapes out, because I think it's going to be a lot of like Labyrinth is going to see a lot of play at first, but it might fall off after a bit. Voiceless might end up being like tier 1 or something like that. But I think it's just interesting to see how bottom heavy the format has become, because before we had like 3 tier 1 decks, 3 tier 1.5 decks, and like it was balanced a bit more between tier 2 and Rogue. And even then there's still a bunch of decks that aren't even on this list you can play, by the way. Again, I forgot Bestial Runic and stuff. But then there's other decks you can play as well and still see success with. I mainly just wanted to focus on the ones that either were priorly in one that still have relevance, or that have recently gotten support out of the Phantom Nightmare stuff. But I just think it's crazy how like bottom heavy that the format, or at least the tier list itself, has become. Even though it might get a bit boring playing against like the same Fire King, Snake Eyes, whatever variants over and over again after a while, I'm still pretty excited for the next format, mainly because there's just a bunch of different decks that I want to play. But I don't know, that's just my opinion. Let me know down in the comments below, because that's gonna do it for the video. If you like it, please sure to leave a like, as well as put this video and the channel into recommended. And if this content is really like the rest of my tier list, then press consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because we're going to 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. Not to mention supports the channel and anything else, and it's absolutely free. Also, you can support me directly while getting some awesome TCG merchandise in the process. Check out Tapio cards down below. Use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout and support me financially. Also, be sure to tell me in the comments below, what deck are you going to be playing this format, as we see all of these different decks dominating the top tables. Once again, that's going to do it for the video, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.